She offered bread to a poor traveler. She didn't know he ruled the entire province. Winter that year did not arrive in the valley of Ashcombe Mere. Collected. It came into the little market town the way a bailiff comes into a small house, patient, uninvited, and carrying a long list. The wind did not howl in the low places between the hedgerows. It counted. It counted the loose slates on the chapel roof and the missing hinges on the mill gate and the thin coats of the children walking home from the last of the harvest market. It counted the empty barrels behind the inn-yard and the unpaid marks on the miller's slate and the boots that had been mended one winter too many. And it counted, as well, a young woman in a plain gray woolen dress walking the long north road out of the town with a loaf of dark rye bread wrapped in a square of cloth held against her chest, as though warming it, as though it were still alive. Her name was Miss Eleanor Marchmont. She was 23 years old that winter, though the woman at the bakery counter still called her child, and the vicar's wife still called her the elder Marchmont girl, and her own father, when he could be prevailed upon to name her at all, called her simply the useful one. She was not beautiful in the way her younger sister Cecily was beautiful, and she had grown so accustomed to not being beautiful in that particular way that she had ceased, some years earlier, to think about the question at all. She had brown hair the color of a wet oak leaf and quiet gray eyes and a small, straight mouth that was said, when it was said of it all, to be kind. She was tall enough not to be overlooked in a room, and thin enough to be overlooked anyway. She wore, that morning, the plain gray woolen dress with the long sleeves and the high modest collar and the neat white kerchief tucked at the throat that she wore every ordinary day. Her cloak was a darker gray, patched twice at the hem where the brambles at the vicarage gate had caught it, and her boots had been her mother's before they had been hers. Her bonnet was straw, plain, and tied with a length of unadorned brown ribbon under her chin. In the parish of Ashcombe Mere she was known for two things. The first was that she was the daughter of the late Reverend Marchmont, who had held the living for 19 years and whose widow, Mrs. Marchmont, now lived in the small stone cottage at the edge of the churchyard on a pension that grew smaller every quarter. The second was that she was the elder sister of Cecily Marchmont, who at 19 was accounted the prettiest young woman in the valley and had been promised, more or less openly, to the son of the local squire, Mr. Harcourt of Harcourt Grange, a young gentleman of easy manners and easier temper, whose regard for Cecily was said, by those who watched such things, to depend chiefly upon the height of her bonnet at any given moment. Eleanor had not, herself, ever been so promised. She had not, herself, ever been so watched. She was, when she was noticed at all, the one who kept the kitchen accounts, and mended the frayed cuffs of Cecily's morning gowns, and read aloud in the evening to her mother from the second-hand cooper on the parlor table, and delivered, twice a week, small parcels of food to the 2 or 3 cottagers in the parish who were too old or too ill or too proud to come to the vicarage door themselves. She did these things without the slightest sense that she was doing anything unusual. She did them because they wanted doing. That morning, the 3rd morning of the first true frost of the year, she was walking north because Mrs. Halliday, who had once been her mother's nursery maid and who now lived alone in a 2-room cottage a mile beyond the last of the town, had not been seen at the pump for 3 days. This, in Ashcombe Mere, meant one of two things. Either Mrs. Halliday was ill, or Mrs. Halliday was too proud to come to the pump because her water pail had begun to leak and she had no coin to pay the tinker. Eleanor, walking the north road that morning, carried in her small marketing basket 1 loaf of dark rye bread, 1 earthenware crock of the yesterday's stew, 1 small twist of tea in paper, and, wrapped in a scrap of old linen at the very bottom of the basket, a length of soldered tin that her father, before he had died, had once shown her how to fit over a leaking seam. She did not think of any of this as generosity. She thought of it as errands. At the low stone bridge that crossed the Ash, the little brown river that gave the parish its name, she paused, because the frost had turned the wooden handrail slick and she did not wish to slip. It was there, at the bridge, at a moment when the low sun was just beginning to break the mist over the water meadows and the whole valley seemed suspended in a thin, colorless gold light, that she saw the traveler. He was sitting on the far side of the bridge on the low stone parapet, with his back against the mile marker. He was, at first glance, plainly a man in some difficulty. His long dark greatcoat was mud to the knees and torn at one shoulder, so that a raw wedge of grayer wool showed through. His boots were sound leather but wet clear through and marked with the pale salt crust that meant a man had walked a long way in weather. His hat, a plain black round-crowned traveling hat with a brim gone soft with wet, sat beside him on the stones. He had no valise, no bundle, no walking stick. He had only, in his gloved hand, a small folded oilcloth, which he was pressing against his own left temple. He was, Eleanor saw at a second glance, bleeding. He was not, at that moment, a man she recognized. He was young, perhaps 28, perhaps 30, and he was tall, even sitting, and lean and dark. His hair was black and cut severely short at the sides but longer at the crown, so that a lock of it, wet, fell across the oilcloth at his temple. His eyes, when they lifted to hers, were the flat, tired, gray-blue of a winter sea. His face was well-shaped and shaved close, though a day's dark stubble had begun to show along his jaw. His mouth was tight from cold or from pain or from both. There was mud on his gloves. There was mud on his cuffs. There was a thin, dark line of drying blood along the collar of his shirt. He did not, when she stopped, greet her. He looked at her, and then he looked away, the way a man who is used to being looked at will look away when he wishes to spare a stranger the awkwardness of being seen looking at him. It was, Eleanor thought, in the split second in which she registered it, a peculiar habit for a beggar to have. "You are hurt," she said, not because it was a question, because he did not seem to have noticed that anyone had come. He said, without lifting his eyes, "It is nothing." His voice was low and carefully pitched and, she thought, tired to the marrow. "It is bleeding," said Eleanor. "It has stopped." "It has not." There was a small silence, during which the mist over the meadows shifted, and a jackdaw called once from the alder, and the traveler slowly, with what appeared to be some effort, raised his eyes to hers again. This time he looked at her fully. It was the look of a man reassessing an assumption he had made without noticing that he was making it. "You are correct," he said quietly. "I beg your pardon." Eleanor set her basket down on the stones. She did not, in setting it down, look at him or at his coat or at the mud at his knees. She did what she would have done for Mrs. Halliday, or for the tinker's boy who once cut his hand on the churchyard gate, or for her own sister when a curling iron had scorched Cecily's wrist. She unfolded the square of clean linen she had been keeping under the loaf of bread. She soaked one corner of it in the small stone dish of vinegar and water she carried in her basket for washing her hands after the crock of stew. She stepped closer to the man on the parapet, and she said, without any embarrassment at all, "Please tilt your head. I do not intend to hurt you." He looked at her again. Not, this time, as a man reassessing, but as a man simply arrested. Then he tilted his head. She pressed the vinegar cloth to the cut, gently, and held it there. It was a shallow cut, a hand's breadth long, above the temple, the kind of cut a man got from a fall against stone or from a low bough at a poor angle. She did not ask which. It did not seem, to her, her business. "There," she said. "Hold that. Press." He pressed. His gloved fingers replaced hers on the cloth. He did not speak. Eleanor, without looking at him, opened the cloth around the loaf of dark rye bread. She broke the loaf, cleanly, in half, the way her mother had taught her to break a loaf that had cooled properly, the way a woman with a bake day at home breaks the yesterday's loaf. She held one half out to the traveler on the stones. "Eat," she said. "You have walked a great distance, and you have not eaten today. I can tell. Eat that first, and then, if you can walk another quarter-mile with me, there is a cottage where the woman will boil water on a real fire, and where you may sit until the bleeding has properly stopped, and where I will pay her for the tea because I am owing her a kindness in any case." He took the half loaf. He did not immediately eat it. He looked at it in his hand, at the dark, dense crumb, and at the pale line of the crust, and something moved in his face that Eleanor did not understand and did not, at the time, examine. Then he said, "Why?" She had not expected the question. She looked at him properly, then, for the first time, not at his cut, not at his coat, but at his eyes. "Because you were hungry," she said, "and I had bread." And she picked up her basket, and she turned, and she began to walk on toward Mrs. Halliday's cottage, without waiting to see whether he would follow. He did follow. Not immediately. She heard, after perhaps 20 paces, the sound of a boot on the stones behind her, and the slight uneven rhythm of a man walking with a cold in his knee, and then, a moment later, he was walking beside her, half a pace behind, half a pace to her left, the position of a man who has been taught, somewhere, that he is not to walk in front of a woman on a country road. He ate the bread as he walked. He ate it slowly, the way a man who has not eaten in some time will eat slowly rather than quickly, because he has learned, somewhere, that eating quickly on an empty stomach is a mistake. He did not speak. Neither did she. The mist over the meadows on the east side of the road began to lift as the sun rose properly over the low shoulder of the down, and the frost on the hedgerows glinted for a moment like nothing so much as the mended silver on the vicarage tea service. She did not, that morning, ask his name. She did not, that morning, ask where he was from, or where he was going, or what had befallen him. She had made him a small offer, and he had accepted it, and the offer, so far as she was concerned, was complete. 200 miles to the south, in a paneled office in Whitehall, a clerk in a black coat was rereading a letter for the third time and finding, still, that the letter did not say what he had been told the letter would say. The letter was 3 days old. It was addressed, in a small firm hand, to the clerk's principal, and it was signed with a single initial, and it said, in essence, that its author would be absent from London for a period of approximately 9 weeks. That during that period the ordinary business of the province of the North Riding was to be conducted through the deputy warden, with the exception of the criminal calendar for the winter assize, which would await his return, that he would communicate by post as circumstances permitted, and that he was to be reached, if it came to that, care of a certain inn in a certain town whose name the letter did not give. The clerk in the black coat rubbed his eyes. The Lord Warden of the North Riding of the province of Ashwater, a man whose face the clerk had never seen, though he had drawn up correspondence in the man's name for 6 years, had, for reasons the letter did not disclose, disappeared into his own province in ordinary traveling clothes, and did not intend to be found. The clerk folded the letter, and, because he was a good clerk, he did not tell anyone what it said. He filed it, and he went to his dinner. Mrs. Halliday's cottage was a low, 2-room affair of grey stone with a slate roof that had been, that summer, retiled at the vicarage's expense. Its door was painted the faded blue of a duck's egg. Its garden was neat, though the roses at the gate had been cut back hard for the winter. Its chimney, when Eleanor came up the last of the north road with the traveller half a pace behind her, was smoking, which meant that Mrs. Halliday was inside, and had a fire, and was, most likely, only ill in the small, private way that Mrs. Halliday had grown accustomed, over the last 2 winters, to being ill in. Eleanor knocked at the blue door with the flat of her hand. 3 short knocks, so that Mrs. Halliday, whose hearing was no longer what it had been, would know who it was. She heard the shuffle of a woolen slipper on the flag inside. The door opened. Mrs. Halliday, when she saw Eleanor, smiled the way an old woman smiles when a young one has been kind to her without saying so. Then she saw the traveller behind Eleanor, and her smile did not falter precisely, but it composed itself into the different smile that a country woman keeps for strangers. "Mrs. Halliday," said Eleanor, "this gentleman fell on the North Bridge and cut his head. May we come in for a quarter of an hour? I have brought tea and I will make it." "You will not make it," said Mrs. Halliday, who had once been a nursery maid. "You will sit, and you will let me make it, and this gentleman will sit by the fire, and I will look at his head, because I looked at your father's head once when he fell off a mare in the churchyard, and I looked at your grandfather's head once when he came home from Chester with a black eye and would not say why." The traveller, on the threshold, hesitated. He said quietly, "I am obliged to you both. I do not wish to trespass." "Sit," said Mrs. Halliday. "You are not trespassing on anyone whose good opinion you require this morning." "Sit." He sat. He sat in the low wooden chair by the fire, and Mrs. Halliday, with the slow, patient movements of a woman who has been nursing men and boys for 50 years, examined the cut above his temple, and pronounced it shallow, and cleaned it again with hot water, and applied a thin strip of goldenrod salve from a stone pot on the mantel, and pressed a folded square of clean cloth against it, and told him, in a voice that did not permit argument, to keep the cloth pressed for a quarter of an hour before he removed it. While the tea steeped, Eleanor took the leaking water pail from the corner of the room where Mrs. Halliday had propped it, and, without asking anyone's leave, she opened the small square of oiled linen at the bottom of her basket and took out the length of soldered tin, and she fitted it, with her small careful fingers, over the seam of the pail as her father had once shown her, and she pressed it down with the flat of the small hammer she kept in her basket for exactly such small errands. And she filled the pail from Mrs. Halliday's stone crock and set it in the middle of the flag floor to see whether it would hold. It held. She noted this without any particular sense of accomplishment. The traveler by the fire, holding the folded square of cloth to his temple as instructed, watched her do all of this. He did not remark upon it. He watched, and his eyes, which had been the flat gray blue of a winter sea by the bridge, had, in the firelight of Mrs. Halliday's kitchen, warmed to something more like the color of a summer cloud at evening. But he did not speak. When the tea had steeped, Mrs. Halliday poured out 3 cups, the good cup that had been her sister's for the stranger, the ordinary cup for Eleanor, the chipped cup that Mrs. Halliday preferred, for herself. She set the good cup on the small stool at the traveler's elbow. She said, "Drink." The traveler drank. He drank the tea slowly, and at one point he closed his eyes for a moment. Not, Eleanor thought, from pain, but from something less easily named. Then he opened them, and he set the cup carefully on the stool, and he said, without looking at either of the women, "I have not been offered a cup of tea in a stranger's house in 10 years. Mrs. Halliday looked at him then, sharply, the sharp look a country woman gives a stranger who has said one true thing without meaning to. But she said only, "Then you have been keeping poor company." He smiled at that. It was a small smile, and it did not reach his eyes, but it was the first smile Eleanor had seen on his face, and it altered the face entirely. It made him look. She noticed this and then set the noticing aside, a great deal younger than she had first supposed. She did not, that afternoon, learn his name. She did not, that afternoon, ask it. When the quarter of an hour was up, and the cloth was removed and the cut inspected and pronounced clean, the traveler rose, and he took his hat, and he said to Mrs. Halliday, "Madam, you have been extraordinarily kind. I shall not forget it." And he said to Eleanor, in a voice pitched lower, "Nor yours." And he laid on the small stool by the fire a single small silver coin, not more than the price of a cup of tea and no less, the exact price of a cup of tea in a country inn, laid with the exact care of a man who knew, precisely, what a cup of tea in a country inn was worth. Then he opened the blue door, and he stepped out into the pale winter sun, and he walked north up the road toward the down. Eleanor watched him go until the road bent behind the hedge. She did not, then, know what she was watching. She thought only that he had walked with a very slight favor of his right knee, and that this was a thing a countrywoman should probably notice in case he was seen again in the parish. "Eleanor," said Mrs. Halliday behind her, "will you take that pail up now and see whether the well water holds it as well as the crock water did? I have known tin patches to fail on cold water when they held on warm." Eleanor took up the pail. She was still, in her mind, on the north road, walking beside a stranger who had eaten dark rye bread as though he had not eaten in a week, and had said, of a cup of tea, that it was the first he had been offered in 10 years. That night, at the vicarage table, her sister Cecily, who had that afternoon returned from Harcourt Grange, remarked that Mr. Harcourt's mother had spoken very kindly of Cecily's new pelisse, and their mother, Mrs. Marchmont, who was thin and tired and whose eyes were bright with laudanum for the pain in her hip, said that this was gratifying to hear, and their father's old curate, who dined with them on Thursdays out of long custom, remarked that the bishop's charge to the diocese had lately been rather severe on the subject of pluralities. Eleanor, who was passing the potatoes, said nothing. She had learned, over 18 years of family suppers, that the potatoes did not require her opinion. But somewhere behind her own quietness she was still thinking about a man who had said, of a cup of tea, that it was the first he had been offered in 10 years. Cecily, at the end of the table, said, without looking at anyone in particular, "Mamma, must Eleanor go to Mrs. Halliday's again on Saturday? She was gone all morning today, and I had wished her to come with me to the milliner." Their mother, whose laudanum was working, did not answer. Their father's old curate, who was not a bold man, said, "Perhaps another day." Eleanor said, "Of course, Cecily," and passed the potatoes. She did not know that night that she had, that morning, given bread to the Lord Warden of the North Riding of the province of Ashwater, that the man who walked up the North Road with a cut above his temple and a half-loaf of dark rye bread in his gloved hand held, in the ordinary course of his office, the criminal calendar and the water rights and the tolls and the assize commissions and the parliamentary interest of every acre of country between the mouth of the Ash and the High Fells 40 miles to the north, including the ground on which the vicarage of Ashcombe Mere stood, and including the tenancy of Harcourt Grange, and including the wardship, though he had never yet exercised it, of every unmarried orphan in the province under the age of 25. She did not know, that night, that he had come north not because he had wished to come, but because he had, 3 weeks earlier, in a locked room in Whitehall, been informed by a physician whom he trusted that he had, for the last 2 years, been slowly killing himself with the pace of his work, and that he had, in reply, said only that he required a horse and a plain coat and 9 weeks in his own province, and that during those 9 weeks, he did not wish to be addressed by any of his titles nor to be recognized in any of the towns of his own jurisdiction, and that he wished, before he returned to that work, to know, once, what it was to be seen not for the office but for the man. She did not know, that night, that he had ridden north from London for 4 days, and that on the 5th, at a poor coaching in 10 miles south of Ashcombe Mere, his horse had gone lame, and that he had stabled the horse and walked on rather than send for another, because he had by then begun, he thought, to hear what it was he had come north to hear, and had not wished to interrupt it. She did not know, that night, that he had walked 7 miles that morning before he had come to her bridge, and that he had not eaten because he had not been able to bring himself to enter an inn, and that he had cut his temple on a low branch 2 miles before the bridge and had not, until she had told him he was bleeding, understood that he was. She did not know, that night, any of this. She knew only that she had given a piece of bread to a stranger, and that the stranger had thanked her, and that she had walked home in the pale winter afternoon and thought, once, without quite understanding why, that there had been something in his eyes that she did not, ordinarily, see in the eyes of the men who came to the vicarage door. She thought, briefly, before she slept, of grey eyes the color of a winter sea, and of a man eating dark rye bread slowly by a north bridge. And she did not think of him again that week. It was the following Tuesday that her father's old curate, dining again at the vicarage, brought the letter. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Marchmont, and it was written in a small, firm hand that Mrs. Marchmont did not recognize, and it was sealed with a plain wax seal, without a crest, of a kind used by any gentleman writing on ordinary business. Its contents, when Mrs. Marchmont read them, first to herself and then aloud, in the parlor after supper, were as follows. The writer, a gentleman traveling in the neighborhood upon private matters, wished to acknowledge, and if possible to make some small return for, a kindness he had received on the North Road on the morning of Thursday last from Miss Eleanor Marchmont of the vicarage. The kindness had consisted, the writer said, of bread offered to a stranger, and of a wound cleaned without a question asked, and of an hour's shelter in a cottage he did not know. He was aware, he said, that the greater kindness had been offered without expectation of any return whatsoever, and it was for that reason, he said, that any return he offered must not be an ordinary one. He would therefore ask if Mrs. Marchmont would permit it, and if Miss Marchmont would permit it, that Miss Marchmont accept, in respect of a matter he did not at present wish to disclose, an offer of marriage, upon terms which could be discussed at Mrs. Marchmont's convenience, at any hour that suited her, at the vicarage or at any other place she named. The letter was signed with a name Mrs. Marchmont did not know. Mr. J. Rowley of Rowley House, in the northern part of the county. Mrs. Marchmont read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the parlor table. Then she looked, for the first time in several years, directly at her elder daughter. Eleanor, she said, in a voice so quiet that her own curate, sitting by the fire, did not at first understand that she had spoken. Eleanor, what have you done? I gave him some bread, Mamma, said Eleanor. He was hungry. You gave him, said Mrs. Marchmont, some bread. Yes, Mamma. And he has offered for you. Yes, Mamma. Cecily, at the corner of the parlor, closed her workbox with a small sharp sound, and said, without looking at her sister, it is a joke. Some gentleman on the road has thought it would be amusing to write a strange letter to a country vicarage. Do not answer it, Mamma. It is beneath you. It is not beneath us, said Mrs. Marchmont slowly, if it is a real offer. It is beneath us if it is not. There was, then, in the parlor, a very long silence, during which the fire settled once in the grate and the curate coughed twice into his handkerchief, and the small brass clock on the mantel struck the half-hour with the thin apologetic chime it had used every night for 20 years. Then Mrs. Marchmont said, Eleanor, tell me exactly what happened. Eleanor told her. She told her about the North Bridge and the traveller on the parapet, and the cut above his temple, and the vinegar cloth, and the dark rye bread broken in half, and the cottage of Mrs. Halliday, and the tea, and the small silver coin laid on the stool. She did not embellish, and she did not omit. She told the story the way she had told her father, when she was a girl, the story of a broken teacup or a torn hem. Plainly, without excuse and without decoration. She told, when she came to the bread, that she had broken the loaf in half because that had seemed the more polite half to offer, since the crust end was the harder end and the man had already been walking a long way in the cold. She told, when she came to the tea, that the small silver coin he had left on the pewter stool had been the exact price of a cup of tea in a country inn, and that this was the small precise sort of detail a man who had been a stranger to no one in his life would not have known how to get right. At the end of it, Mrs. Marchmont was quiet for some minutes. Then she said, "Was he a gentleman?" "I do not know, mamma. He was quiet. He was courteous." "Was he a young man?" "He was not old, mamma. Perhaps 30. "Did he speak like a gentleman?" "He spoke as an educated man speaks, mamma. But not, I think, like a man used to being obeyed." Mrs. Marchmont looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she said, "Eleanor, I am not a well woman. Your father left us less than the parish supposes, and I have not been able to make his pension go as far as I once could. Your sister will marry Mr. Harcourt, we hope, in the spring. But marriage costs money we have not got, and Mr. Harcourt's mother has begun, lately, to look at us the way a woman looks at a horse she is about to refuse to buy. If this letter is real, and if this Mr. Rowley of Rowley House is what he says he is, then I cannot, in good conscience, tell him no on your behalf before I have at least met him." Cecily, at the corner of the parlor, said sharply, "Mamma, you cannot mean it. You do not know this man. He may be anything." "I do not know this man," said Mrs. Marchmont. "That is precisely why I intend to meet him. Eleanor, will you agree to my meeting him?" Eleanor, who had not, in 23 years of a quiet life, been asked her opinion of any matter more consequential than the quantity of sugar in a Sunday preserve, was for a moment unable to answer. Then she said, "Yes, mamma, if you wish it." "That is not what I asked you, Eleanor." "Do you wish it?" Eleanor thought, then, of gray eyes the color of a winter sea, and of a man who had eaten dark rye bread slowly by a north bridge, and of a voice pitched low that had said, of a cup of tea, that it was the first he had been offered in 10 years. She thought of these things without wishing, exactly, to think of them, and without knowing, exactly what to think of them, and she said quietly, and with a very slight color rising into her cheeks, "I am content that you meet him, mamma. I will abide by your judgment." Mrs. Marchmont wrote her reply that same night. It was not a warm letter. It was a plain, courteous, careful letter, of the kind a widow of very reduced means writes to a gentleman she does not know, requesting the honor of an interview at the vicarage on the following Saturday, at any hour of the afternoon that suited him. She signed it with her name in a shaking hand, and she sealed it with the seal of her late husband's ring, which she had not used in 6 years. He came on Saturday at 3 o'clock. He came in a plain dark traveling coat, not the muddy greatcoat of the North Bridge, but a clean, well-cut, sober coat of the kind a country solicitor might wear on a Sunday. He came on a plain bay horse. He came without a servant. He knocked at the vicarage door himself. He was shown into the parlor. He bowed to Mrs. Marchmont and to Cecily, and last to Eleanor, whose eyes, when they met his, did not quite know where to rest, and finally rested on the pin at his cravat, which was small and gold and very plain. He spoke first with Mrs. Marchmont, alone, for 3/4 of an hour, in the parlor, while Eleanor and Cecily sat in the small breakfast room with the door closed. Eleanor did not know what was said in that 3/4 of an hour. She knew only that when the parlor door opened and Mrs. Marchmont called her in, her mother's face was very pale and very still, and that Cecily, who had been listening at the door, Eleanor knew this without needing to ask, had gone very quiet. In the parlor, alone with him and with Mrs. Marchmont, Eleanor sat in the small hard chair by the fire, and Mr. J. Rowley of Rowley House sat opposite her in the chair her father had used for 36 years, and Mrs. Marchmont sat between them at the parlor table with the letter under her hand. He said quietly, "Miss Marchmont, I have asked your mother's permission to make you, in person, the offer I made in writing. She has consented that I may. I shall not detain you long." "Sir," said Eleanor, I am, he said, a man of some means. Rowley House is not large, but it is comfortable, and it is well staffed. My affairs are settled and my debts are none. I am 28 years old. I am not encumbered by any prior attachment and I have no expectation of any. Sir, I offer you, he said, marriage upon 3 terms which I have already stated to your mother and which I now state to you. The first is that the marriage take place within 1 month of this day, quietly, at the parish chapel here or at any chapel you name. The second is that you consent to live at Rowley House until such time as I may communicate to you a further arrangement, at which point you may consent or refuse as you see fit. The third is that you agree that, for reasons which I shall not, at present, explain, and which I shall explain in full at a date not more than 9 weeks from today, my full name, my full history, and my full circumstance shall not be known to you until that date. There was a silence. Eleanor looked at her mother. Mrs. Marchmont did not look back. Sir, said Eleanor, may I ask, without offense, why? You may, he said. Miss Marchmont, when you offered me bread on the North Road last Thursday, you did not know who I was, and you did not ask. I have discovered, in the last 10 years, that this is a thing so rare in my life that when it occurs perhaps once. I have come to the conclusion, in the last week, that I do not wish it to occur only once. I have therefore come to your mother's parlor to ask that it not. Eleanor looked at him then, properly, for the first time since he had entered the room. He looked, she thought, like a man who had rehearsed the sentence several times, and who was, nevertheless, uncertain at the end of it, whether he had said what he had meant to say. She said quietly, Sir, may I ask one thing further? You may ask anything. Are you, in the ordinary sense of the word, an honest man? He did not answer at once. He looked at her steadily, with the grey-blue eyes she had seen at the North Bridge, and then he said, I am Miss Marchmont, a man who has done a great deal of work, in a place where honesty is difficult, and who has, so far as it has been in his power, been an honest man in that work. I cannot make you a larger claim than that, and I will not pretend to. She thought about this in the silence for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she looked at her mother. Mrs. Marchmont, without looking up, said, Eleanor, I have satisfied myself, from documents this gentleman has laid before me, that he is who he says he is, and that Rowley House is his, and that his means are sufficient. I have not satisfied myself as to the third of his terms. Only you can do that. Eleanor looked at Mr. J. Rowley of Rowley House. She said quietly, Sir, I accept your offer. They were married on the 24th day of the month, at the parish chapel of Ashcombe Mere, at 10 o'clock in the morning, in the presence of Mrs. Marchmont, of Cecily Marchmont, of her father's old curate, and of 2 men whom Mr. Rowley presented as his steward and his steward's clerk. There were no announcements in any London paper, though the reading of the banns had been dispensed with by license. A license produced, Mrs. Marchmont noted privately, with a speed and a discretion that were more usually associated with the marriages of great personages than with the marriages of country brides. Eleanor wore a plain gown of dove-grey silk that had been her mother's 22 years earlier. The gown had been let out at the seams by Mrs. Halliday and taken in at the waist by Eleanor herself, and pressed by the vicarage's one servant, and it was worn that morning with a long-sleeved bodice, a high modest collar, a small lace kerchief at the throat, a plain straw bonnet, and a fine white cotton veil that Eleanor's mother had worn on her own wedding day. The veil had, in the corner, a small darn where a moth had once been at it. Eleanor left the darn where it was. Cecily did not weep at the wedding. Mrs. Marchmont did. Mr. J. Rowley of Rowley House, when he was asked at the altar to take Eleanor Marchmont for his wife, said, I do, in the low, careful voice she had heard by the North Bridge. When she was asked in her turn, she said the same. He placed on her finger a plain gold band without inscription. He kissed her, at the sign of the vicar, once on the temple, very briefly, very lightly, and she thought, with an old-fashioned formality that she found she did not dislike. They left the chapel in a plain closed carriage. The carriage had no crest on the door. Its horses were dark bays, well matched. Its driver was a man of 40-odd in a plain grey coat. It took them, that afternoon and that evening, north through the valley over the down, and along the high road for 4 hours until, at dusk, in a fold of the hills that Eleanor had never before seen, they came, through a plain iron gate set in a low stone wall, up a long straight drive of pale gravel to the house. Rowley House was not large. That is, it was not large as the great houses of the province were large. It had 2 full stories and an attic of pale weathered stone with a slate roof and a modest pediment over the door and 8 sash windows across the front. It was, Eleanor thought, a gentleman's house of the last century, the house of a man of comfortable means and severe taste. There was, so far as she could see in the failing light, no fussy shrubbery on the drive, no ornamental parterre, no ostentatious statuary. Only clean gravel, low box hedges, and, at the corner of the lawn, a single very old copper beech. She was shown, at the door, by a small woman in a black stuff gown, into a hall of pale stone flags and a warm firelit corridor and, at last, into a small, plainly furnished, warmly lit bedchamber on the first floor, where a fire was burning, and a supper on a tray was set on the small round table under the window, and a plain white nightgown had been laid out on the bed. Her husband was not, at that hour, anywhere she could see. The woman in the black gown, who introduced herself as Mrs. Bligh, the housekeeper, said quietly that Mr. Rowley had asked that Eleanor be permitted to eat her supper alone, and that he would call upon her in the morning, at a reasonable hour, and that if there were anything she required, anything at all, she had only to ring. Eleanor thanked Mrs. Bligh, and closed the bedchamber door, and sat down on the low chair by the fire and did not cry. She had not cried in 7 years. She was not going to cry that night. She ate a small piece of cold ham, and a small piece of bread, pale bread, not the dark rye bread of her mother's oven, and she drank a cup of weak tea, and she put on the plain white nightgown, and she got into the strange bed, and she lay in the dark listening to the sounds of a house she did not know. She thought, before she slept, "I have married a man whose full name I do not know." She thought, "He has been kind." She thought, "The pale bread on the supper tray in the strange kitchen is not the bread of her mother's oven, and the pillow beneath her cheek is not the pillow of her mother's linen press, and the small square of window above her bed does not look out on the churchyard yew." She thought, without alarm and without regret, that this was, in the ordinary sense, the beginning of the rest of her life, and that she did not, at 23, know yet what to do with such a beginning except to sleep in it. She thought, at the very edge of sleep, gray eyes the color of a winter sea. The first 3 weeks at Rowley House were, in almost every respect, formal. Her husband, she called him, when she called him anything, Mr. Rowley, because she had been told to and because there was no other name she was permitted to use, was courteous, punctual, absent. He rose early. He rode out, most mornings, at 8, in the plain gray coat and the plain black boots and the plain black hat of a country gentleman, and he did not return until dusk. He dined with her, at 7, in the small dining room on the ground floor, with 2 candles and a decanter of very good claret between them, and he spoke to her, at dinner, of the weather and of the state of the road from the town, and of the pheasants he had seen in the copse behind the west lawn, and of the pheasants he had not shot because the copse was, he said, thin that year and would not stand hard shooting. He did not, in 3 weeks, speak to her of himself. He did not, in 3 weeks, ask her any question she was not able to answer in a sentence. He slept, she understood, in a bedchamber on the far side of the corridor. He did not, at night, come into her room. He did not, at any hour, touch her, beyond the light dry press of his gloved hand on her wrist when he handed her into the carriage on the 2 occasions when they drove out together to the parish chapel on the Sunday. He was, she thought, waiting for something, though she did not know what. She was not, herself, unhappy in this arrangement. She had not expected, at 23, to be married at all, and she had not expected, having been married, to be immediately fond of the man to whom she had been married, and she had learned, in 23 years of a quiet life, that the ordinary business of a household could absorb a great many hours of a woman's day without any particular help from her husband. She rose early. She walked, in the mornings, in the small walled garden behind the house. She read, in the afternoons, in the small library on the ground floor, which was well stocked, but which she found, she noted, was stocked with a rather large number of books on the criminal law of the northern province of Ashwater, and on the water rights of the northern rivers, and on the assize procedure of the last 30 years, and with almost no novels. She wrote on the 4th day to her mother. She wrote on the 7th to Mrs. Halliday at Ashcombe Mere. She did not write to her sister Cecily. She did not, at that time, know what she would have said. On the 15th day, she began, without being asked, to keep the household accounts. Mrs. Bly, on being consulted, produced a book. The book was neat and correct and, Eleanor discovered on her second afternoon of study, wrong. It was wrong in small, patient, systematic ways, the ways in which the accounts of a household run by a good housekeeper for an absent master will, over a year or two, become wrong, because the good housekeeper is not a thief and does not intend to be wrong, but is not a bookkeeper either. Eleanor, at the small writing desk in the library, in the pale afternoon light, spent 5 days quietly correcting 3 years' accounts, without saying to anyone that she had done so. On the 20th day, at dinner, her husband said, without preface, "Mrs. Rowley, I understand that you have been at the household accounts." Eleanor set her fork down very carefully. She said, "Yes, Mr. Rowley. I hope I have not overstepped." "You have not," he said. "Mrs. Bly has told me that you found 3 years' errors and did not remark upon them to anyone." "I thank you. You are welcome, sir." There was a small silence, in which the 2 candles between them guttered once in a draught. Then he said quietly, "May I ask why you did not remark upon them?" "Because Mrs. Bly is not a thief," said Eleanor. "And because you had not asked me to." He looked at her then. He did not, in 3 weeks, look at her often. But he looked at her then, and Eleanor thought, for the second time in her life, that his gray-blue eyes had, in the candlelight, warmed to something more like the color of a summer cloud at evening. He said, "Mrs. Rowley, I have been an absent husband." "You have been," said Eleanor, "a busy one." He almost smiled at that. He did not quite smile. He said, "Would you object if, at breakfast tomorrow, we sat at a smaller table?" "Sir? The dining room is a long room," he said, "and this is a long table, and I have observed that a candle at each end of a long table is not, in the ordinary way, sufficient to warm the middle of it. I wonder whether, in the small breakfast room at the small round table, we might, perhaps, be less cold." Eleanor, who had not been asked for a household preference by any man since her father had died 6 years earlier, thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "I should like that, Mr. Rowley." "Then it is done," he said. The next morning, at breakfast, in the small breakfast room on the east side of the house, the small round table was set for 2, with a single candle in the middle, though the sun was already up. Her husband was there before her. He rose when she came in. He held her chair. He poured her a cup of tea himself, and passed her the small pot of dark honey without her asking, and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Rowley." She said, "Good morning, Mr. Rowley." That was the day, though neither of them knew it at the time, that Rowley House began to be warm. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. By the end of the 5th week at Rowley House, the small round table at the small breakfast room on the east side of the house had become a private country of its own. It was there, in the pale early light, over the pot of dark honey and the plate of thin toast and the small round of yesterday's butter that Mrs. Bly brought in on a plain white dish, that Eleanor and her husband, gradually, at first without noticing that they had began to speak. They spoke, at first, only of small things, of the pheasants in the copse, of the state of the road from the town, of a lame categour's boy on the north side of the estate for whom Eleanor had, on her 2nd week, ordered a pair of new boots without asking anyone's leave, and of whose gratitude Mr. Rowley had heard, at the parish gate, from the boy's own mother, of a book of engravings of Roman ruins which Eleanor had found on the 3rd shelf of the library and which, she confessed one morning, she had for 2 days been unable to put down. Her husband, hearing this, sent, that afternoon, without remark, to a bookseller in the north town, and there arrived, 3 days later, a small parcel containing a 2nd volume of engravings of Roman ruins, and, at the bottom of the parcel, wrapped separately in brown paper, a small pocket-sized edition of Cooper's poems. Eleanor, on unwrapping the Cooper, sat down on the low library chair by the window and did not, for perhaps a full minute, move. She had said once at breakfast, in an aside so slight that she had assumed her husband had not heard it, that her mother's second-hand Cooper had had a broken spine and that she had read it to her mother from a book that fell open at the same place every time. She had not said, and did not know how her husband could know, that the place at which the book had fallen open was the 7th page of the task. She opened the pocket Cooper. She turned to the 7th page of the task. The page was uncreased. The spine was sound. The paper was new. She closed the book and set it on her lap, and looked out of the library window at the copper beech at the corner of the lawn, and thought. He was listening. That evening, at dinner, she said only, "Mr. Rowley, I thank you for the books." He said, "You are welcome, Mrs. Rowley." Neither of them mentioned the task. In the 6th week, a woman arrived at Rowley House. She arrived without notice in a plain black carriage on the 2nd afternoon of the week, and she was shown by Mrs. Bly into the small yellow drawing room on the ground floor, and Mrs. Bly came to Eleanor in the library and said quietly that the master's aunt, Lady Margaret Rowley, had come. Eleanor set down the pen she had been using to write to her mother. She smoothed the front of her plain gray woolen morning dress. She said, "Then I shall come." Lady Margaret Rowley, when Eleanor came into the yellow drawing room, was standing at the window with her back to the door. She was tall and very upright and thin, and Eleanor saw when she turned, perhaps 60 years old, with iron-gray hair drawn severely back under a small dark widow's cap, and eyes the same gray-blue as her nephew's, and a mouth that had been, for perhaps 40 years, tight. She wore a plain black silk gown with long sleeves and a high modest collar and a small cameo brooch at the throat. She looked at Eleanor from the window for perhaps 5 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "Sit down, child. I have not come to eat you." Eleanor sat. Lady Margaret Rowley, who did not sit, said, "My nephew has written to me. He has written to me a letter of 2 pages, of which 1½ pages concern the state of a lame categories boy and the 6th shelf of the library, and half a page concern you. In the half page that concerns you, he tells me that he has married. In the half page that concerns you, he does not tell me your family, your fortune, or your circumstance. This is a most unusual letter from my nephew, whose letters, in ordinary matters, are notorious for their exhaustiveness. I have therefore come to see you myself." "Ma'am," said Eleanor. "Do not call me ma'am," said Lady Margaret. "It is a servant's word. Call me Aunt Margaret, since I understand you are now entitled to. Now, I will ask you 3 questions, and I will draw my own conclusions. Your answers must be truthful and short, and I will not repeat them." "Yes, Aunt Margaret." "First, were you told, before you were married, who my nephew is?" "No, Aunt Margaret. I was told his name. I was told his house. I was told his means were sufficient. I was told that his full circumstance would be explained to me by a certain day, which has not yet come. You accepted his offer on those terms." "I did." Eleanor considered this. She said quietly, "Because I did not think, ma'am, Aunt Margaret, that a man who had eaten dark rye bread by a north bridge and said of a cup of tea that it was the first he had been offered in 10 years, was likely to be, in the ordinary sense, a dishonest man." Lady Margaret Rowley was silent for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she said, "Second question. Have you, since coming to this house, asked any servant, or any tradesman, or any tenant, or any neighbor who my nephew is?" "No, Aunt Margaret." "Why not?" "Because I gave my word that I would wait until the day he named." Third question. "Do you love him?" Eleanor did not at once answer. She looked at Lady Margaret Rowley, and Lady Margaret Rowley looked at her, and there was in the older woman's severe face an expression that was not precisely kind, but was precisely attentive. And Eleanor said slowly, "I do not know, Aunt Margaret. I have not been long enough in his company to know. I know that I am not indifferent to him. I know that at breakfast this morning, when he passed me the pot of honey without my asking, I felt something in my chest that I have not felt before. I do not know the name of what I felt, but I think in the ordinary course of things that it will have a name in a year." Lady Margaret Rowley looked at her for a long moment. Then she sat down at last, in the chair opposite Eleanor's, and she said, in a voice that had altered subtly, "My dear, I am, I confess, relieved. I had come north expecting to find my nephew married, in one of his sudden fits, to a foolish woman. I find instead that he has married a woman who has read my late husband's copy of Cooper. I recognize the edition on the small table there, and who does not, when questioned by a formidable widow, either weep or lie. I shall stay to dinner, and when my nephew returns from wherever he is today, I shall not tell him what I have asked you, and you shall not tell him either. Is that agreed?" "Yes, Aunt Margaret." "Good. Now, ring for tea." Lady Margaret Rowley stayed a week. In the week she stayed, she taught Eleanor, without appearing to teach her anything, the shape of the household she had married into. She spoke of the copper beech at the corner of the lawn, which had been planted, she said, by her nephew's grandfather in 1774, on the day the deed to the estate had been signed. She spoke of the two portraits in the small dining room. One, a grave dark man in a black coat, was her late husband, her nephew's uncle. The other, a young woman in a pale muslin gown with a modest high neckline, was her nephew's mother, who had died when he was 11. She did not speak at any point of what her nephew did with his days. She did on the third evening, when she and Eleanor were sitting alone in the yellow drawing-room, and Mr. Rowley was, as usual, out until dusk, look up from her needlework and say, quietly, Eleanor, may I say one thing to you as an aunt? Yes, Aunt Margaret. My nephew is a man who has been, for the last 10 years, in a place where every person he meets wants something of him. He has learned in that place to see through a great many people. He has not learned in that place to be seen. If in the end he tells you what he does, and if in the end you do not think less of him for it, you will have given him something that no other person has given him in 10 years. Do you understand me? I understand you, Aunt Margaret. Then say no more of it, and pass me that black silk thread from your workbox. By the end of the 7th week, Eleanor was, without having intended to be, the mistress of Rowley House. She had, without asking, taken over the ordering of the linen. She had, without asking, taken over the small pension of the 2 elderly underservants who lived, retired, in a cottage at the edge of the estate. She had, without asking, begun to sit in the afternoons in the small stone porch behind the west lawn with a book and to speak in the ordinary course of things to any of the estate people who passed. The head groom, the gardener's boy, the tenant of the north farm, the woman from the dairy, because it seemed to her that a mistress of a house who did not know the names of the estate people was, in the ordinary sense, useless. She had also begun imperceptibly to look for her husband at breakfast. She did not know when she had begun to do this. She only knew that, one morning, coming into the breakfast room and finding the small round table set for only one because Mr. Rowley had ridden out at 6, she had felt in her chest the same nameless small movement she had felt on the morning of the pot of honey, and had understood, sitting down alone at the small round table, that the movement had a name after all, and that the name was disappointment. She did not, that morning, examine the discovery further. She drank her tea and she buttered her toast, and she went to write to her mother, who was ill again, and to send a small parcel of new candles to Mrs. Halliday, who had written twice. On the 4th day of the 8th week, her husband, at breakfast, set down his teacup and said, quietly, Mrs. Rowley. Yes, Mr. Rowley. On the 22nd of this month, in 11 days' time, there is a ball at Velicott Park, which is the seat of my neighbor to the north. My aunt has written to me from London that she will be there, and that she wishes us to be there also. I have not, in 7 years, attended a ball at Velicott Park. I do not ordinarily care to, but I find this year that I do care to. Eleanor set down her cup. She said, Sir, there will be present at Velicott Park, he said, a very large number of people who will wish to know who you are. Some of them will be, in the ordinary sense, kind. Some of them will not. I have thought about this at some length, and I have decided that I do not wish, on that evening, to be a coward about it. I intend, on that evening, to name myself in full to you in this room before we go. I ask only that you allow me, in the 10 days that intervene, to have those 10 days as they have been. Eleanor looked at him. She said quietly, Yes, Mr. Rowley. Thank you, he said. They did not, in those 10 days, speak of it. They went on as they had been going on. He rode out in the mornings. She kept the accounts and walked in the walled garden and wrote her letters and, in the afternoons, read Cooper by the library window. He returned at dusk. They dined in the small breakfast room at the small round table. He passed her the pot of honey at breakfast. She passed him the salt at dinner. On the 4th of those 10 days at dusk, he brought her, from the north town, a bolt of silk. The silk was not white. It was not blue. It was not the color of any ball dress Eleanor had ever seen. It was a soft, muted, deep sage green, the color, she thought, of the underside of an olive leaf at evening, with no pattern, no sheen, and no ornament of any kind. He set the bolt on the table in the library, and he said, Mrs. Rowley, I think this color would suit you. But you are to say if it does not, and I shall return it. I have not, in 10 years, chosen a dress for any woman, and I make no claim to the taste I do not possess. Eleanor looked at the bolt of silk. She looked at her husband, who was standing very straight by the table with the light of the reading candle on one side of his face, and whose gray-blue eyes were, she thought, once again the color of a summer cloud at evening. She said quietly, "It will suit me, Mr. Rowley. Thank you." The gown was made, in the 6 days that remained, by Mrs. Bligh's sister-in-law, who had been, in her youth, a dressmaker in the North Town. It was a plain gown, long-sleeved, with a modest high collar, a small band of pale cream lace at the wrist, and a soft full skirt that fell to the floor. It had no train. It had no jewels sewn to the bodice. It had no ornament at all beyond the cream lace at the wrist and a single narrow ribbon of the same cream at the waist. On the day it was fitted, Eleanor stood in front of the tall glass in her bedchamber and looked at the woman in the sage-green silk, and thought, "I do not look like anyone I know." On the evening of the 22nd at 6 o'clock, she came down the stairs of Rowley House in the sage-green silk, with her brown hair drawn simply back into a small knot at the nape of her neck, with the cream lace at her wrists, with her mother's white cotton veil. No, not the veil. She had left the veil in a drawer. She wore, instead, at her throat, a single narrow ribbon of the same soft cream, and on her finger, the plain gold band without inscription. Her husband was waiting for her at the foot of the stairs. He was in evening dress, a plain black coat, a white waistcoat, a plain white cravat, a plain gold pin. He looked at her, when she came down, in a way he had not previously looked at her. Then he offered her his arm, and he walked her into the small library. He closed the door of the library behind them. He said, quietly, "Mrs. Rowley." "Yes, Mr. Rowley." "My name," he said, "is not, in the ordinary sense, Mr. Rowley. My name is James Alaric Rowley, 7th Baron of Rowley, and I am, by the King's commission of the 3rd year of the reign, the Lord Warden of the North Riding of the province of Ashwater. I hold, in the ordinary course of my office, the criminal calendar and the water rights and the parliamentary interest of every acre of country between the mouth of the Ash and the high fells 40 miles to the north. This is the ground on which the vicarage of your mother stands. This is the ground on which Rowley House stands. This is the ground over which, at Velicott Park tonight, I shall be received, when I choose to be, as a Lord Warden is received. I did not tell you these things at the North Bridge, because at the North Bridge I did not wish to be a Lord Warden. I did not tell you these things in your mother's parlor, because in your mother's parlor I did not know, then, whether you would still offer me bread. I do not, now, ask you to forgive me for the withholding. I ask you only whether, knowing what I have now told you, you will go with me to Velicott Park tonight, and stand beside me there as my wife." Eleanor was silent for perhaps 10 seconds. She thought, in that silence, of many things, of Cecily at the corner of the parlor, of Mrs. Halliday's kitchen, of the pot of honey at breakfast, of Lady Margaret Rowley's severe attentive face, and at the end of the 10 seconds she said, quietly, "Sir, I will." "Thank you," he said. "But Mr. Rowley." "Yes." "Before we go, I should like to ask one thing." "Anything." "On the North Bridge," she said, "that day, were you making a study of me?" "Was I?" "No," he said at once. "No, Mrs. Rowley. I was tired. I was hungry. I was in some pain. I had come north expressly to see whether there was, in the province of my office, one person who would treat me as a stranger and not as a warden. I had not, at the North Bridge, planned that person. When you gave me the bread, I did not plan what I did next. When I wrote to your mother, I planned it very carefully. But at the bridge, no. At the bridge, I was only fed." She looked at him. She said quietly, "Then we may go." They went. The plain-closed carriage. She saw, that night, for the first time, the small crest on the panel of the door, which was a stylized copper beech in silver on a green field, took them the 6 miles north to Velicott Park. The great house of Velicott Park was lit that night from every window, and the drive was lined with link boys, and the sound of an orchestra playing was already audible on the last of the drive. Eleanor sat very still in the carriage. Her husband did not speak. He held her hand once, briefly, on the last of the drive and let it go. They were announced at the top of the ballroom stairs, by a footman in a livery Eleanor did not recognize, in a voice pitched to carry to the far wall. Lord Rowley, Warden of the North Riding, and Lady Rowley. The ballroom did not, precisely, fall silent. It did what a very great room of very well-bred people does when it has, in its ordinary course of gossip, been given a piece of news it did not have. It rearranged itself. Every head in the room turned, at least once, toward the two figures at the top of the stairs, the tall, dark, quiet man in the plain black coat with the single plain gold pin, and on his arm the tall, brown-haired young woman in the sage-green silk with the cream lace at the wrists. Then, slowly, the ordinary business of the ball resumed. Lady Margaret Rowley met them at the foot of the stairs. She said, in her severe, attentive voice, without looking directly at either of them, "Well, it is done. I shall introduce you to the two people you need to know, and after that you may stand where you please." She introduced Eleanor to a small, sharp-faced dowager duchess whose name Eleanor did not, in the moment, catch, and to a tall, kind-eyed magistrate of the North Town who bowed over Eleanor's hand as though she had been born to it. Then Lady Margaret Rowley withdrew into the crowd. Eleanor stood beside her husband, for perhaps 20 minutes, at the foot of one of the ballroom's white pillars, and greeted, in her plain, quiet way, the perhaps 18 or 20 people who came, one after another, to be introduced to her. She did not know any of them by sight. She noticed, without wishing to notice, that half of them looked at her as one looks at a small unfamiliar animal one intends to name later, and that the other half looked at her as one looks at a woman one has decided in advance to dislike. It was at the end of the 20 minutes, when the orchestra began the first of the country dances, that the second stranger of the evening approached them. The second stranger was a woman. She was, Eleanor thought, perhaps 26 years old. She was very handsome, in the tall, fair, high-boned way that was accounted, that year, the fashionable kind of handsome. She was dressed in a gown of deep crimson silk with a low square neckline that was, by the standard of the ballroom, at the very edge of what was permitted. Her arms were bare above her long white gloves, and at her throat she wore a heavy necklace of dark rubies. She had pale blonde hair dressed high with 3 ostrich plumes, and her eyes, when they came to rest on Eleanor, were pale blue and cold, and Eleanor thought very tired. She was, Eleanor also thought, a woman who had cried recently and was pretending that evening that she had not. Her name, when Lady Margaret Rowley, coming back through the crowd, was compelled to introduce her, was Lady Serena Vellicott. She was, Lady Margaret Rowley said in the small dry voice of a woman making an introduction under duress, their hostess's elder daughter. Lady Serena Vellicott curtsied to Lord Rowley with a precise, elegant courtesy that meant nothing. She looked at Eleanor. She said, in a bright, carrying, clean voice that was pitched. Eleanor understood at once. Not to Eleanor but to the 6 or 7 people standing within 12 feet of them. Lady Rowley. What a very pretty gown. I understand you were a Miss Marchmont. Of Ashcombe Mere, is it? The vicarage? Yes, said Eleanor quietly. How charming, said Lady Serena Vellicott. And I understand the acquaintance began, how did I hear it, on the road? Some little incident with a fall from a horse? How very romantic. Quite like a novel. There was, in the 6 or 7 feet around them, a small precise silence. Lord Rowley, at Eleanor's side, did not, so far as Eleanor could tell, alter his expression. He said, in the low, careful voice she had heard by the North Bridge, Lady Serena, I do not think you have quite the account. My wife did not know at the time who I was. That is precisely why I offered for her. Oh, said Lady Serena Vellicott very brightly. Oh, but of course, that is what makes it quite like a novel. But, my dear Lady Rowley, do you know my mother had had it from someone in the town that you had, how shall I say, that your mother's circumstances were very reduced, and that Mr. Harcourt of Harcourt Grange had been on the point of proposing to your sister? Was it a sister? Cecily? She pronounced the name with a small deliberate mispronunciation, and that Mr. Harcourt was, of course, so relieved when the warden took the trouble off the family's hands. It is very fine of Lord Rowley, do you not think, my dear Lady Rowley, to have relieved you? The silence in the 6 or 7 feet was no longer small. 2 women behind Lady Serena Vellicott turned their heads away, deliberately, at that precise second, so as not to be seen at close range. A tall gentleman in a dark blue coat, who had been about to walk past the group, did not walk past. He stopped. Eleanor did not at once answer. She looked quietly at Lady Serena Vellicott. She saw in Lady Serena Vellicott's very pale blue eyes, at very close range, that this was not, in the ordinary sense, hatred. This was, Eleanor knew the shape of it, though she had never before seen it in a ballroom. The shape of a woman who had, some years earlier, expected to be Lady Rowley herself, and who had discovered that night, in the announcement at the top of the stairs, that she was not, and would not be, and had chosen, in the 20 minutes since, that if she could not have that name she would at least take from the woman who had it whatever small dignity she could take in 20 minutes at the corner of a ballroom. It was not, in the ordinary sense, a personal cruelty. It was, in the words Lady Margaret Rowley might have used, a hatred that had nothing to do with Eleanor and everything to do with a thwarted ambition of her own. Eleanor, in that half-second, understood this entirely. And she also understood that she was not going to say so. She smiled very slightly. She said, in her ordinary plain quiet voice, "Lady Serena, I am obliged to you for the interest. My mother's circumstances are, indeed, reduced. My sister is called Cecily, and Mr. Harcourt's intentions, so far as I am aware, are his own to declare. As for my husband, I am well aware that he took no trouble off my family's hands. I have every reason to believe that whatever trouble he took because he chose to. I do not think it is in me to speak for him further. If you will excuse me, I hear the second country dance beginning, and I have not yet been shown the ballroom." She curtsied quite plainly. She turned. She took her husband's arm again. His gloved hand under her fingers was very still, and she walked with him, without any hurry, into the wider part of the ballroom. She did not, at the time, know that within a quarter of an hour Lady Serena Vellicott would have been overheard by 3 separate people, insinuating that the marriage license had been irregular, that Lord Rowley's traveling clothes on the North Road had, in fact, been not a private eccentricity but a device to procure a wife under a false name, and that a certain document, an unsigned letter, she said, a piece of correspondence her father had inherited from an old family friend in the province, could, if produced, cast very serious doubt on the honor of the marriage entirely. She did not, at the time, know that Lord Rowley knew all 3 of these things by the end of the second country dance. She did not, at the time, know that within an hour, in the small library at the far end of Vellicott Park, in the presence of the small sharp-faced Dowager Duchess and of the tall kind-eyed magistrate of the North Town and of Lady Serena Vellicott's own father, Lord Vellicott, a heavy, gouty, mortified old man in a dark plum coat, the unsigned letter would be produced from Lady Serena Vellicott's own reticule, that it would be shown, by the magistrate, to be a forgery of 8 days' age at most, that Lord Rowley would decline, publicly, to press any charge against Lady Serena Vellicott because he said he did not consider her, in the ordinary sense, capable of the charge, and that Lord Vellicott Ashen would ask quietly that his daughter withdraw to the country for the remainder of the season, and that Lady Serena Vellicott would withdraw. She would only know these things by the following morning, from Lady Margaret Rowley. What she did know, at the moment the second country dance began, was that her husband had guided her, without speaking, to the far end of the ballroom, and that at the far end of the ballroom he had quietly stopped and turned to face her, and that he was looking at her, with the grey-blue eyes that had been by the North Bridge the color of a winter sea and were at that moment the color of a summer cloud at evening, and that he was about to speak. He did not first speak to her. He turned first to the ballroom. There was, at the far end of the ballroom, on the raised gallery where the orchestra sat, a small step that a gentleman could stand upon in order to be seen. Lord Rowley did not stand upon it. He did not need to. He was, in the ordinary sense, a tall man in a plain black coat with a plain gold pin, standing at the foot of the gallery in front of his wife, and when he lifted his voice, quietly only to the level of ordinary courteous speech, the ballroom around him, as a ballroom will, when it has been waiting for the second thing to happen, quietened around him without his asking. He said, in the low careful voice that Eleanor had heard, first, by the North Bridge, "My friends, my neighbors, I have been for 7 years in this province an absent host. I have not, in 7 years, come to a ball at Vellicott Park. I have not, in 7 years, been able to tell you in any of your houses why. Tonight I mean to correct that. I have, this season, taken a wife. Her name is Eleanor. She was, until 8 weeks ago, Miss Marchmont of the vicarage of Ashcombe Mere. She is, tonight, Lady Rowley. There has been, in the last hour, some suggestion that I ought to be at pains to explain why. I intend to be at pains. I chose her not for her family, though her family is old and quiet and honorable, and has held a country living without disgrace for 100 years. I chose her not for her fortune because she has none. I chose her not for her beauty, though I find her beautiful, because I do not think at this age I ought to be choosing a wife for her beauty, and because I do not think, in her own account of herself, she would have understood the compliment. I chose her not for her connections, and I chose her not for her name. I chose her because on the North Bridge above the Ash, on the morning of the 7th of this month, when I was a stranger to her and she to me, and when I was cold and hungry and bleeding, and when I did not know that I had spent 10 years without being offered a cup of tea in a stranger's kitchen, she offered me bread. She did not ask who I was. She did not ask what I could do for her. She asked whether I was hurt. She asked whether I was hungry. She did not ask a further thing. I chose her because in the 8 weeks since, in a house that I had left cold for 7 years, she has done the ordinary quiet work of a mistress of a house without being asked to do it, and without being thanked for it, and without any expectation of being either. I chose her because she has read my late uncle's Cooper and did not tell me she had done so. I chose her because she found 3 years' errors in the accounts of my house and did not tell me she had found them. I chose her, in the end, because when I told her, tonight, in the library of my house, that I was in the ordinary course of my office the Lord Warden of this province, and had been so on the North Bridge and in her mother's parlour and at the altar of her father's chapel without her knowing, she did not weep and she did not reproach me, and she did not ask what advantage she might now have of me. She asked me one question. She asked me whether, on the North Bridge, I had been making a study of her. And when I told her, honestly, that at the North Bridge I had been only fed, she said we might now go to the ball. I say this to you, my friends and my neighbors, because there has been, in the last hour, some suggestion in this room that my wife owes me a debt, and that I have been at pains to relieve some trouble of her family's. I wish to say to you, all of you, in this ballroom, without any ambiguity, that no such debt exists. If there is a debt in this marriage, my friends, it is mine. It is mine, and I do not, ordinarily, care to be a man who owes debts. But I find, tonight, that I owe this one gladly. My wife has taken no trouble off my hands. She has given me my life. I mean by that, she has given me back the private one, which I did not know I had, until a stranger on a country bridge offered me a piece of dark rye bread and did not ask my name. Good evening. And thank you, all of you, for coming. He turned. He offered Eleanor his arm. The ballroom did not, for perhaps 5 seconds, know what it was permitted to do. Then, in the corner, the sharp-faced Dowager Duchess brought her fan to the palm of her gloved hand. Twice, in the small precise applause of a great personage giving permission. And the ballroom, from every corner, applauded quietly and, at first, unsurely, and then, at the second wave, with the ordinary open warmth of a country ballroom that has decided, in a body, that it approves. Eleanor did not, at once, look at her husband. She looked, first, at the polished floor, and at the toes of her own plain sage-green slippers. Then, after a moment, she looked up. His gray-blue eyes were the color of a summer cloud at evening. He said only to her, quietly, Mrs. Rowley. Yes, Mr. Rowley. Will you dance? I shall. They danced. He was a competent, not a showy, dancer. She had been taught, at 12, by her father's old curate, on the flag floor of the vicarage kitchen, and she had not, in the 11 years since, danced with any partner who cared whether she was doing it well. She discovered that night that when a competent partner does not care whether one is doing it well, and only cares that one is dancing with him, one dances better than one had known one was able to. He led her, at the end of the first country dance, without asking, off the floor and down a corridor of white pillars to the small stone terrace behind the ballroom, which was cold and empty of any other guest, and lit only by the light of the ballroom windows falling out onto the flag stones. He stopped there. He turned to face her. He said, quietly, Mrs. Rowley, may I be permitted at last? Sir? He did not, for perhaps a second, answer. Then he laid the fingers of one gloved hand very lightly along the line of her jaw. He looked at her, at the plain brown hair drawn simply back, at the small straight quiet mouth, at the gray eyes that were, at that moment, wider than he had ever seen them, and he said, in the low careful voice she had first heard by the North Bridge, "I have wished, since the North Bridge, to know what your name would sound like in my own house. I know it now. I have wished, since the morning of the pot of honey, to know what your hand would feel like on my arm at a ball. I know it now. I have wished, since the third week of your Cooper on the library table, to know whether one day I might be permitted quietly in the ordinary course of things to kiss you. I do not, ordinarily, ask a question I have not already thought about at some length. I am asking one now." Eleanor did not at once speak. She lifted very slightly her chin. She said quietly, "Yes, Mr. Rowley." He kissed her on the small stone terrace, once very briefly on the mouth. He kissed her again once, less briefly. Then he stepped back one small formal pace, and he offered her his arm, and he took her back into the ballroom, and Lady Margaret Rowley, standing near the far door, did not, for the sixth time that evening, look at either of them. It was a year later, in the pale spring light of a Thursday morning, that Eleanor Rowley, now in the ordinary usage of the province, Lady Rowley, though she was still called Mrs. Rowley in the small breakfast room by her husband, who had not, in 12 months, unlearnt the habit, walked down from the terrace of Rowley House with a small basket over her arm and, walking beside her, the small round dark-haired child of 8 months, whom she carried in that basket in the ordinary careful way of a country mother who has walked out with her son a great many times before. The child's name was Henry John Rowley. He was born on the 17th of the previous December, in the small square bedchamber at Rowley House. He was, at 8 months, a quiet child, with a round grave face and his father's grey-blue eyes and his mother's brown hair, and he was Mrs. Halliday, who had come north for the birth and had, on being asked, agreed to stay a further 6 months to see her charge properly on his feet, was fond of saying, "A child who did not, ordinarily, cry unless he had a reason." She had said this to Eleanor on the evening of the birth, and Eleanor had said quietly, "Yes, that is his father in him." Lord Rowley, now at 29, thin still, but with a colour in his face that Whitehall had not seen on it in 5 years, was walking that morning on the far side of the lawn, with a plain grey coat, a plain black hat, and a plain walking stick, and he was, when Eleanor came down the terrace steps with the basket over her arm, standing under the copper beech at the corner of the lawn, in conversation with a tall thin man in a black coat whom Eleanor recognized as the tall kind-eyed magistrate of the North Town. The magistrate, when he saw Eleanor, bowed. He said, in the ordinary friendly way of a man who had come to know her in the last year, "Lady Rowley, good morning. I shall not keep your husband above another quarter of an hour. He has been telling me, at considerable length, of a certain question of the parish tithe of Ashcombe Mere, which I am obliged to tell him is not, ordinarily, his concern." "Then," said Eleanor quietly, "you must be firm with him, Mr. Ashford. Rowley House will not be sorry to see him idle for a quarter of an hour." The magistrate laughed, and bowed again, and Lord Rowley, without looking at his wife, said, "Mrs. Rowley, where does the basket go this morning?" "To Mrs. Halliday's," said Eleanor. "She has moved into the North Lodge, as you know. She has, this week, a leak in the water pail. Again. She will not have a new pail. She says the pail was her sister's." "Then take her one of the old pails from the dairy," said Lord Rowley, "and tell her it was mine. Tell her I have no use for it, and that I would take it as a very great personal favor if she would consent to fill it, on the ordinary Thursday, with the ordinary water. Ashford, you understand me. That is not, in the ordinary sense, a warden's business." "I understand you, Rowley," said the magistrate dryly. "It is a matter of a leaking pail, which is not, ordinarily, a warden's business. It is, ordinarily, a very great personal favor." They finished their conversation under the copper beech. Eleanor, walking on with the basket and the child, thought, as she had thought once or twice in the last year, not often, but once or twice, of a small silver coin laid on the stool by Mrs. Halliday's fire, and of the exact price of a cup of tea in a country inn. Cecily had married Mr. Harcourt of Harcourt Grange in the summer. The marriage was, in the ordinary sense, a good one, and Cecily was, at last account, tolerably content, which was, from Cecily, as much as could be expected. Mrs. Marchmont, at Ashcombe Mere, was in the ordinary sense not well, but she was no longer in reduced circumstances. A small quarterly pension, arranged discreetly by Lord Rowley through a bank in the North Town, had, without her ever knowing whose it was, made the vicarage of Ashcombe Mere solvent for the first time in 9 years. Lady Margaret Rowley had, over the winter, taken to writing to Eleanor once a week with news of London, and with severe attentive advice on the household management of Rowley House, and with, in every fourth letter or so, a small private note about a book she had read and thought Eleanor might like to read. Lady Serena Vellicott, in the year, had married a colonel of the North Sea garrison and had removed with him to Portsmouth, and had not been heard of at Vellicott Park since. The lame Categer's boy from the north side of the estate, the one for whom, on her second week at Rowley House, Eleanor had, without asking anyone's leave, ordered a pair of new boots, was now, at 11, apprenticed to Lord Rowley's steward's clerk, and was said, in the steward's private opinion, to be already the best hand at a ledger in the North Town. Eleanor did not know that Lord Rowley had ordered this. Lord Rowley did not know that Eleanor had, on her second week, ordered the boots. At the North Lodge, Mrs. Halliday, standing at her blue door in a plain black stuff gown and a clean white kerchief, took the basket and the pail and the child in that order, and she said, without ceremony, "Eleanor, come in and sit. The kettle is on." Eleanor sat in Mrs. Halliday's kitchen, in the low wooden chair by the fire, with Henry John Rowley on her lap, and Mrs. Halliday made the tea. She poured out 2 cups, the good cup that had been her sister's for Eleanor, the chipped cup that Mrs. Halliday preferred for herself. Mrs. Halliday looked at the pail on the flag floor. She said quietly, "It is a better pail than my sister's, Eleanor." "Yes, Mrs. Halliday. It is his." "Yes, Mrs. Halliday. He has grown thoughtful." "He has always been thoughtful, Mrs. Halliday. He was only tired." Mrs. Halliday nodded once, slowly. Then she said, without looking at Eleanor, in the quiet voice of a woman who has known a family for 40 years, "Eleanor, I have thought, in the last year, of the morning of the North Bridge." "Do you know what I have thought?" "No, Mrs. Halliday." "I have thought," said Mrs. Halliday, "that you were seen that morning on that road. That your father had said once when you were a child that you were a girl who did the ordinary work of the world without expecting to be seen for it, and that God, if he is in the ordinary business of paying attention, would one day arrange for you to be seen. I have thought that year that God arranged for you to be seen on the 7th of December, by a tired man on a North Bridge, and that God is, in the ordinary sense, a slow but a careful arranger." Eleanor did not, at once, answer. She looked at her son on her lap, at his round grave face and his gray-blue eyes, and she looked at the pail on the flag floor, and she looked at the fire. She said, quietly, "Mrs. Halliday, I was not, on the 7th of December, thinking of being seen. I was thinking of a leaking pail, and of a Categer whose stew was in my basket. I was thinking of the frost on the handrail of the bridge, and of whether I would slip on it, and of whether Mrs. Halliday's water pail would hold a second season if I could fit the tin over its seam correctly. I was not, in any part of my mind, thinking of a husband, or of a great house, or of a copper beech at the corner of a lawn I had never seen. That," said Mrs. Halliday, "is the point." Eleanor smiled, then very slightly, and she leaned her cheek, for a moment, against the round dark hair of her son's small head, and she said, "Yes, Mrs. Halliday, that is the point." Before she left the lodge, she asked Mrs. Halliday whether she had heard, in the town that week, of any traveler on the roads who had needed shelter. Mrs. Halliday said that she had. She had heard of a young widow, walking north from the coast with a small child of her own, who had stopped at the White Hart at the town for one night and had gone on the following morning, and had left at the inn, in the ordinary sense, no name. Eleanor thought about this quietly. She said, "If she is heard of again, Mrs. Halliday, will you send to me at the house?" "Of course, Eleanor." "Thank you." Eleanor walked back to Rowley House that afternoon in the pale spring light, with the child in the basket over her arm, and with the light of the copper beech at the corner of the lawn falling across her face as she came up the drive, and she thought, at that moment, of a North Bridge, and of a piece of dark rye bread, and of a stranger who had said of a cup of tea that it was the first he had been offered in 10 years. She did not, at that moment, know that her husband, at the far end of the lawn, had, without her seeing, stopped his walk with the magistrate to watch her come up the drive with their son, and that he was, in that moment, thinking that he had been, at every important moment of his life since the age of 28, seen, even when he had thought he was invisible, by the woman who had, on a north bridge, only offered him bread. That evening, in the small breakfast room, at the small round table, over a plate of dark rye bread from the ovens of Rowley House and a small pot of dark honey and 2 cups of tea, Eleanor said to her husband, quietly, "Mr. Rowley." "Yes, Mrs. Rowley. There is, at the White Hart in the town this week, a young widow with a small child of her own, walking north from the coast. I have asked Mrs. Halliday to send to me if she is heard of again. Then I shall send Ashford's clerk down in the morning," said Lord Rowley, "to find her before she is walked off. And I shall put her, if she consents, at the North Lodge, and I shall put her child, if she consents, in the small nursery here, and I shall find her, in the ordinary course of the estate work. If, of course, you approve." "I approve, Mr. Rowley," said Eleanor. "Then it is done," he said. Then he passed her the pot of dark honey without her asking, and the 2 candles between them, in the small breakfast room, guttered once in the draught from the window, and the copper beech at the corner of the lawn stood in the last of the spring evening light, and the household of Rowley House was, in the ordinary sense, at rest. Before I let you go tonight, I have one more story for you. Next week, on this channel, we will bring you the tale of a duke who arrived, in torn traveling clothes, at the gate of a small country inn on a snow road, and of the innkeeper's daughter who fed him at the kitchen fire without ever once asking his name, and of what he did 1 year later when he came back for her in a crest-marked carriage. It will be, in the ordinary sense, another story of an ordinary woman on an ordinary road, and of the small quiet moment that changed her life, though she did not know it at the time. If you have loved this story, you will love that one. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.